Well, grace is one of those things that those of us who are followers of Christ, and even people who are not necessarily Christians, are well aware of. It's interesting that the most popular song in the history of recorded music, written music, is Amazing Grace. That song, Amazing Grace. It's been re-recorded and sung more times than any other song on the planet. And it's known by more people than any other single song in the world. And it's been sung around the world. And the reason is because it speaks of this singular, unique characteristic of the Christian gospel, which by its own definition, Paul referred to as the gospel of grace, which means the good news of grace. The good news is that we're not under the law. The good news is that we're not being measured and disqualified from heaven because we don't live perfect and sinful lives. The good news is God has pronounced grace over us the moment we come to Him and surrender our lives to Him and ask Him to come into our hearts, that He speaks grace over us, and that grace is what makes us into holy people. We don't become holy because we've behaved without sin. None of us can make that claim. We become holy because God has pronounced us as being holy. So I know you look in the mirror and you see all your flaws and foibles. You see your physical flaws and foibles. You see your moral flaws and foibles. But the simple fact is that those are not disqualifiers in the eyes of God. If I confess my sins, He not only forgives me, but He begins to work in me. I always say that God forgives and then He fixes. He begins to work at changing those things. And that's the process that we go through in our Christian life and our Christian growth. And all of that is an expression of God's grace. Grace, as we've talked about many times, means undeserved favor, undeserved merit or blessing. In other words, God will bring prospering into your life that you don't deserve. There are good things that happen in your life that should not happen if you're to be measured by your performance. The very fact that I was forgiven of my sins when I came to Christ is an expression of that grace, that prospering. My soul prospers in Christ because of His grace. And that's why Paul said, it's all of grace. I am what I am by the grace of God. It has really little to do with me. It has everything to do with Him. And that's what we find, that grace is always hard to grasp because it's such an unbalanced concept. It's all of God, it's none of me. And we want to find something that's of me. Somewhere I'm in there, that somehow, yeah, it's God, but I contributed in some important way. I'm sorry to disappoint you, that if you do anything good, it's God. When you do things bad, it's on you, but God will forgive you if you come to Him. And so it's always of Him. It's always of His grace. And one of the most valuable things that we get from grace is a second thing: peace to you from God our Father. You see, Paul says this in Romans 5. He talks about how that there was this antithetical relationship between us and God before our salvation, that before I was saved by grace, I was an object of God's wrath. That's the way that Paul put it in Ephesians chapter 2. An object of God's wrath. What a terrorizing thought. That, in other words, what he said was that God looks at you and He knows eternally or eventually you would have gone to hell. You would have been a victim and treated the wrath of God because of your sinfulness. And that would have happened even before you came to Christ. I know that before I came to Christ, my life was pretty rotten, pretty miserable, pretty unhappy. Even though I had a lot of advantages that most people didn't have, I was not a happy person. There was this big hole inside of me, and I kept on doing things trying to fill that hole, which was even just making the hole deeper. And that's really, we often talk about people running from God. Well, what they're doing is they're digging the hole deeper. They're not going anyplace. They're not getting away from God. They're just digging the hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's what I was doing. In trying to fill the hole, I ended up digging deeper and sinking deeper and deeper into sin and transgression. And when I finally came to Christ and said, Lord, forgive me, His grace began to fill the hole. And He began to pull me out of that pit. And my life began to experience new and wonderful things. And the most wonderful thing is what Paul talks about in Romans 5. He says, is the peace of God. It begins with peace with God. In other words, God is no longer my adversary. I'm no longer living my life in opposition to God. I'm trying to figure out how to cooperate and submit and follow Him. I want to bring my life into alignment with Him on an increasing level. And that's a lifelong journey, a lifelong effort, and we'll never get it perfectly right. But that's what happens as we begin to say, I want to be at peace with God. I don't want to be in opposition to God. I don't want to be doing anything that's going to bring the judgment or the wrath or the punishment or the discipline of God upon my life. I want to be in that place where I'm pleasing in His sight and He can bless my life to the utmost. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean you'll have a problem-free life, but it does mean that you'll have the ability to be at peace on the inside, even when things around you are going crazy, much like we see in the world today. For example, I know that probably many of you are real stressed about what's happening with the economy. 25% of people in the United States have expended their savings accounts and now are trying to live on their credit cards, whose basically payment rate is going up all the time as the interest rates rise. I mean, it's really a scary thing for many people to be in, and you wonder, where's this going to end, and where will I end up, and will I be overtaken? I talk with people on a weekly basis who are fighting the battle against fear because there are fearful things happening in their life. And what God says to us is, if we really have been touched by the grace of God, which happens when we come to Christ, then we can be at peace in the inside, even though those kind of things don't look good. That here's the amazing thing, that God has the ability to speak into your circumstance and work miraculous changes. And he can fix stuff. He can provide for you. He can supply for you. He can meet your needs. And I've come to realize through hard effort that many times when things aren't working out the way I want them to, it's because maybe I've been pushing in the wrong direction and God's trying to redirect my paths. God uses adversity a lot of times to redirect us. Who was it? C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our prayers, and He talks to us through His Word, and He shouts at us through pain. And I found that in my life, that there are sometimes I have these very painful, emotionally and even physically times where I've been in pain, and it's those times where I really start tunneling into God more earnestly because I need His comfort. I want to hear His voice. And oftentimes the solution has come when God has been able to alter my perspectives, change my point of view, and help me to see things with a whole new way and head in a whole new direction. So, this process that we go through is so integral to what it means to be an effective follower of Christ that oftentimes we find ourselves like the Apostle Paul before his conversion, that we're kicking against the goads. And, part of the idea, a goad was a long pole that had a sharp metal tip on it, and they used it to drive an oxen. Oxens don't follow reins. You can't rein in an oxen. They would drive an oxen by hitting it in the buttocks with this sharp pole because they're such massive creatures, and then it would start moving. Well, that's the way it is with us sometimes. We got this wall of goads, if you will, and we're trying to push against them, and we can't figure out, why is this so painful? And God isn't saying, I want you to feel the pain. He says, I want you to pull back and ask yourself, God, why is this door closed? Why is this situation changed? Why is this not working out? Why is this problem arisen? And start asking Him instead of spending hours trying to figure your way out of the problem or to force your way through. I used to love reading the Far Side cartoons, and I remember one of my favorites was a picture of a boy going to school, and he's pushing as hard as he can on the door to open the door, and it won't open. And it says, the title of school says School for the Gifted, and then on the door it says pull. And so here's this gifted child who's trying to get in by pushing as hard as he can on the door, and he just needs to read the sign. It just says pull. I think sometimes our life's like that. We're pushing so hard to make something happen when God says, really, if you just step back, you'd realize that if you just pull this, it'll all work out. Now, sometimes you have to pull hard and long for a long time, but still the point is that you're not alone and God isn't leaving you adrift. He has a plan for your life, and there's things He wants to work out. And the sooner you begin to embrace that reality and pursue that plan, saying, God, show me what you have for me, the more peace you're going to be able to find in your life, and the more fulfillment you'll find in the things that you're doing. So, hope those are words of encouragement. We've managed to get ourselves all the way through verse 2. Tomorrow we're going to pick up in verse 3 of Colossians chapter 1. God bless you. Go in His grace.